Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Cage, which I am calling, really isn't, but I'm going to just say for the sake of it, that this is episode 1 of season 1 of Star Trek, the original series. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek, the original series, one episode at a time. So this is the first video. I've done, of course, a lot of Star Trek episode reviews, but I'm now on the mission to review every single episode in order, or at least the ones I haven't covered yet, in order. And this is where I'm starting here with the very first episode that was ever made for Star Trek. Now, when I'm going to be doing my episode reviews for the original series, I'm numbering it in order of production, in order that it was made, not in order it was aired, because I think that is the correct way. I've talked about this before in other videos I've done, and because it was just aired out of order for, monetary reasons, but it actually, especially the first season, doesn't really make any sense if you watch it in air date. It makes way more sense if you watch it in production date. So even though this episode actually didn't air until like the 80s, in the 90s, it wasn't actually released in this form until the 90s, I would say. It's the first episode that was ever made for Star Trek. This was the very first pilot that, of course, was rejected. Now, I've talked about this before when I covered Where No Man Has Gone Before, which is the second pilot that was made and the one that was accepted by the studio, that I actually prefer The Cage over Where No Man Has Gone Before. I prefer Jeffrey Hunter over William Shatner. I prefer Pike over Kirk. I think that this was a better crew, this was a better episode, and I think the network execs are wrong and had sort of probably other things in mind, like there wasn't enough action in it. They probably wanted a captain who was more confident and not doubting himself, and they probably, of course, complaining about there being a woman first officer on the bridge. How dare they do that? Take that away. And too intellectual, I think they actually said was a note. That's why it's better. But anyway, so I actually prefer The Cage over Where No Man Has Gone Before. But something that many people have noted before, that it was extremely rare. I don't know if this was the only time, but it was extremely rare for a show or a network, that is, to reject a pilot but then greenlight another one. Usually, if a pilot was rejected, then it's rejected. Your show's no good. Get out of here. It's kind of unheard of for them to actually give them a second chance. So I think they liked the general premise. There was just like the details, the ones I just mentioned, that they didn't like, so they probably went back and were like, tweak those. Funny enough, though, one of their main notes was get rid of the dude with the pointed ears. He looks weird, was the one thing that Roddenberry refused to do. But they eventually took it anyway. They said he looked too much like the devil, which was fucking stupid. But anywho, I guess this shows you what TV network execs were like in the 60s. But on a more personal note, this is one of the first episodes of the original series I ever saw. I saw a couple scattered episodes, mainly just pieces of episodes. I always recount Bread and Circuses as being the first episode I ever watched. Just sat down and watched. However, I didn't see the whole thing because I was watching on a VHS tape and it cut out before the last 5 minutes of the episode, so I actually didn't see the whole thing. And yeah, I actually liked it at the time. That's actually one of my least favorite episodes. But when I actually went to watch Star Trek. I watched the movies first in the early 90s when I was like 11, 12 years old, and that's when I really started getting into Star Trek. So I went back and watched some of the episodes of the original series and Next Generation that were on reruns, and so I was watching them kind of both concurrently, but I was more of a fan of the original series at that time because the movies were my into, so I was more into Kirk and Spock and all them. Of course, that would change drastically in a few years. But so The Cage just happened to be one of the first episodes that was airing on reruns when I was watching it, and so it was one of the first ones I saw. And for the longest time, I did consider this one of my favorite episodes. Now later, for a brief moment in time, if you see this top 10 original series, I think I took it down, but one I did like in 2011, I mentioned the Menagerie in my top 10 rather than The Cage, because I could just, without going back and watching the episodes, I kind of convinced myself, because there's this subplot of, Spock capturing the Enterprise, that the episode's actually better because it adds more to it. But historically, I always liked The Cage better. And looking back on it, I definitely like The Cage better. I think I just wasn't considering, I hadn't actually seen the episodes recently when I made that decisions, but actually, more recently, I put The Cage in my top 10 and the Menagerie was in my top 25 or something. But anywho, this is... During the course of these reviews I'm going to be doing for the original series, a recurring theme will be that I don't like William Shatner's acting. I don't think he's a good actor. I remember I did a top 10 favorites or best Star Trek actors videos. Some people were like, "Oh, you forgot to put William Shatner." I'm like, no, I didn't forget. Like, he definitely doesn't deserve. Maybe in the worst category, honestly. Like, yeah, I think his acting is way over the top in some cases. Now, not always. Sometimes he does a good job. City on the Edge of Forever, a great example of that. And there are other instances where he does a decent job. But a lot of the times his acting really blows it for me. And just sitting down and watching this episode with an analytical mind, which is not something I always do, and really paying attention to it, I noticed for the first time that Jeffrey Hunter is a really good actor. And he's much better than Shatner, I'm sorry. And I think Pike is a more interesting character than Kirk simply because he's more flawed. And I think that's one of the notes the studios have make him less flawed, and so they made Kirk. Kirk does have some nuance and some flaws, to be fair, the way he's written, but he is mostly your hero character, someone you want to be, someone you want to look up to, someone who's always right and always in the right, and someone you can always cheer for, like the stereotypical hero character, which was, I believe, in the 60s and 70s and 80s a lot more commonplace and a lot more where we have to have this great hero. Whereas Pike was portrayed, it starts out with him doubting himself. He even wondering if he should be captain at all, and feeling the weight of the guilt of the lives that he lost under his command. And so I have a feeling that did not fit the stereotype that the network execs and perhaps even audiences were going for in their action sci-fi adventure. They just want, the great captain who can do no wrong, which is a stereotype that I personally don't like. that was one of my strikes against Babylon 5, was I felt like that captain was too much of the stereotypical great sci-fi hero captain, handsome man. And I like a bit more nuanced captain, which is why I gravitated a lot towards Sisko in Deep Space Nine. In fact, Pike. Cisco, I think they kind of based him off of Pike a bit, because in that pilot episode, he also was reluctant and didn't really want the job and was thinking about quitting Starfleet, where this is definitely how Pike is portrayed. But during the course of the episode, you see him start to realize that Starfleet is where it belongs, and just like, of course, Emissary did with Cisco. And so I think they did kind of base it off of this, but I think that works much better than Where No Man Has Gone Before. Is Kirk is this great captain who has this friend who have zero chemistry, and I don't buy their friendship, and he's forced to kill his friend, and I don't care because they have no chemistry and I don't buy their friendship. So this is a way better pilot. But and as I said, like, yeah, Jeffrey Hunter does like an amazing job of portraying that hauntedness, but yet someone who's still in command and someone who still has the command of others, and who won't back down. And he does a much more nuanced job. And a lot of times when I watch the original series, because I haven't seen, and I don't watch very many shows or movies from the 60s. So when I watch the original series, which is by far the thing from the 60s I've seen the most, because I've seen every episode multiple times. When I watch it, I kind of dismiss a lot of the over-the-top, cheesy acting as, well, that's of its era. Which is true. Like, melodramatic acting, and I talked about this before in other videos, is more commonplace the further back you go, because movies were originally based off of plays, which was the only form of sort of acting before the motion picture came along. And so the further back you go, the more theatrical the acting is, but the more contemporary you get, the less theatrical, and the more it goes into what is known as film acting, which is trying to play completely subtly, which is different, very different than theatrical acting. So the further back you go, the more theatrical the acting is. And so I kind of dismissed a lot of the over cheesy acting and bad acting from the original series as just that. Oh, this is of the 60s. They were more melodramatic and over the top back then. But watching this episode and paying attention to Jeffrey Hunter, I just keep wanting to say Jeffrey Wright, but that's a different actor. But paying attention to Jeffrey Hunter, he is a good actor. He doesn't play it over the top. And come to think of it, there were movies I've seen from the 60s which featured good acting that was more subtle and not too melodramatic and over the top. So even though it was more commonplace, it's not unheard of that. It's not impossible to have more nuanced and complex performances, which is really what I think Jeffrey Hunter gives. Now, Leonard Nimoy, of course, is a great actor, but Spock is a kind of different kind of performance, and they do him over the top sometimes, but I blame that more on the writers and the directors. But anywho, yeah, so it's a shame that I feel like. And I also remember when I was a teenager, first got into Star Trek, I was obsessed with Pike because I liked him more than Kirk. So if there's any novel or anything that featured Pike, I would go out and read it, and I wanted a Pike show. Now, of course, all those many 30, 40 years later, I finally got my Pike show, which is an amazing show, so I'm a happy camper. But, to be fair, Anson Mount Pike is very different than Jeffrey Hunter's Pike. They're almost two entirely different characters. Jeffrey Hunter's Pike is definitely more reserved, more haunted, as I said, more nuanced. Where Anson Mount, and don't get me wrong, Anson Mount is fantastic, and he does a fantastic job as Pike. I love Anson Mount's Pike, but he's a different character, which is neither good nor bad. And as I said, I wouldn't change anything about Strange New Worlds. It's an amazing show, definitely the best newer Star Trek show. But my point is, it's not the same thing. Someone like one of the showrunners involved with Strange New Worlds said, "Oh, this was a show that got picked up 50 years after the pilot was made, or more than 50 years, like 60 years after the pilot was made." But I don't think that's completely accurate. This is it's very, very, very loosely based off of it. They changed a lot of things, and of course, other than Spock and Una, who wasn't even called Una in this episode, just number one. That was something they made up for the newer things because she needs a name. But other than those characters who are all very different, none of the characters are the same. They didn't get rid of that. They didn't keep that funky dude with the red hair who goes, "Oh, Captain!" whatever, who is in this, or that old doctor dude. Which is fine. I don't mind. They didn't need to keep those dudes, or that young yeoman that has the hots for Pike. Yeah, definitely don't keep her. Here's the thing, there's a lot of. I don't try to fit this episode into canon. I was just reading on the Memory Alpha all the inconsistencies this episode has with canon, but I don't actually care because I really just chalk that up to Star Trek didn't exist yet. This is a pilot of some sci-fi adventure show, and this is the first episode ever written for it. Terms like Starfleet, Federation, Romulans, Klingons, none of that will come until years later. So, and especially the whole lore and backdrop and history of Star Trek wouldn't come till 20 or 30 years later. So, when I was watching this episode recently, I tried to watch it by forgetting everything I knew about Star Trek, and because that's how it was made. When the people first, the execs and whoever first saw this episode, there was no Star Trek. This was its own thing. This was a new thing, a new show, and so I tried to watch this episode in that light. And not worry about Spock smiling or them saying time warp factor or the time barrier is broken or all the other inconsistencies that are in it. I just shrug it off I don't care, because this is a new thing. This is something that had no established lore when it was written. And on those terms, I really like it. I think it is amazing. I think it was definitely the stronger pilot for sure. As I said, I would put this in my top 10 of all of Star Trek episodes. Because it does that good character story with Pike from the beginning, where you buy his wanting to quit Starfleet, his being sick of life, and then being forced into this situation where he's thrown into a cage and has to deal with these almost invincible to beat aliens. And I like how they're not too invincible, like Q or that fucking god creature from that Gary Mitchell became and where no man has gone before. That's less interesting because they're too powerful, and you don't really buy someone being able to defeat a god like that. Whereas here, the stakes were more realistic. Like, these Telosians were extremely powerful and almost impossible to defeat, but not completely impossible the way a godlike figure would be. So, it was definitely more interesting to me. Now, I got to bring up Forbidden Planet. To be fair, I've never seen that movie. It came out in the 50s, I believe, a good 10 years before this came out. Or was made, I should say, because it didn't come out until the 80s. Or not in its true form. Of course, there's the menagerie, so footage from this episode was released in 66, but the full true form wasn't released until the 80s. But regardless, this was made about a decade after Forbidden Planet, and I was reading a lot online about how a lot of people say this is just ripping off Forbidden Planet, and it's just like a copy, a rip-off, borrows too heavily, some people might say, if they're being generous. I have, as I said, I've never seen Forbidden Planet, so I can't speak to that. But I read a couple of synopsis. It was about, and there's some differences. Like, I definitely see they did take a lot. Like, the whole structure of Star Trek was lifted from Forbidden Planet, that being of like a naval type structure to a starship and focusing on a captain, first officer, and doctor. And this episode in particular dealt with, these beings who can create illusions that are really real, which was also the case in Forbidden Planet. And there's a love interest there who was from the planet that the captain travels to. So, yeah, there are definitely some similarities. But not having seen the movie, having heard about it, there are differences too. There's what happens in the planet, some of the characters and different, and the Telosians seem to, even though they have illusionary powers, they seem to be very different than the aliens they encountered in Forbidden Planet. So I wouldn't say it's like a carbon copy, but I would say this is a tad bit unoriginal, which maybe might be part of the reason why the network called for another pilot, because they might say, we like this concept, but can you not do Forbidden Planet? could be, maybe, I don't know. But anywho, so it's a very interesting concept and I do like how we start the episode seeing, that scene with Pike talking to the doctor, who I kind of see how him as a prototype of McCoy, how they would eventually write McCoy. And this is probably like the cliche Western doctor based off a lot of the cowboy shows they had during the 60s, because they were trying to emulate them, because that's what was popular. And that's why he brings them like a whiskey to drink. I could see cowboy shows doing that. But anyway, but it does bring up a fascinating thing about how he's like just tired and just kind of, and the weight of all the guilt of the people who died is weighing on him, and I think that's really believable. But he mentions in the scene several things that he actually will see play out in the fantasies that the Telosians create for him. He mentions the attack on Rigel 7, I can't remember what it was. They had those creatures, whatever, which we will see play out in this fantasy. He mentions that he wants to just hang out on his farm in Mojave, which is apparently like not a desert anymore. They made it green, and that's where he grew up. And we see that play out where he just rides horses every day. And then the other thing was becoming a Orion slave trader. Now this is before Star Trek. I gotta keep reminding myself, but for someone in Starfleet, the Federation, and let's throw out Starfleet Federation, Star Trek doesn't exist. A hero captain we're supposed to identify with as a slave owner and trader. That's pretty irreconcilable. And some of this is something Strange New Worlds would never do, and it's something that they kind of had to gloss over here. It's kind of I would say dehumanizing, but they're aliens anyway, but it's kind of, I don't know, it's making analogies to actual human beings on our planet. so yeah, that part's a bit outdated. To be completely put it completely mildly, and to be completely as fair as I possibly can, I'll say it's outdated. But anywho, and like Vina, when she's playing the Orang girl, dancing girl, whatever, they do play her as really into it and aggressor, so not really, a slave against her will or whatever, but still it's, I don't know. Still, they use the word slave. It's just, don't do that. Anyway, but yeah. So I've heard some people refer to this as like a zoo type episode. Like there's a episode of the Orville where, the main captain and his wife, first officer, kind of hate that show. They get put in a zoo, and all these aliens come by and look at them, and someone's like, "Oh, that's kind of ripping off the cage," and I'm like, no. That zoo trope has been done before a lot, but I don't think this is it. I wouldn't say this is the zoo trope. The zoo trope was actually done in the animated series. I think the episode was called Eye of the Beholder, where Kirk and crew are looking for these scientists, and they find that these scientists were put in the zoo, and they get turned to the zoo as well by these super advanced aliens that don't really see them as a higher life form. And that was more of the zoo type episode. And there's been tons of cartoons and shows that did the zoo cliche. But I think the cage is different because it's not, even though they do show other, creatures being kept in these cages, it's, the point isn't like a zoo. It's not to have, these weird creatures on displays so all the kids and everyone can come look at them, like those other zoo type episodes, like the Orville one I mentioned, the animated series ones I mentioned, many more. I remember one from Buzz Lightyear as well. There used to be a show in the early 2000s, a cartoon that came on show. Anyway, and I'm sure there's many, many more. I'm just not remembering. That's more of a situation where the characters are thrown in a cage, put on display, and people go to the zoo, or the aliens or whatever that run it, their children go to the zoo and sit there and look at them. Which is not what happens here. In fact, we learned later on that the Telosians are going extinct, and they want the human beings, since they're the most adaptable species they come across, to survive them and help them survive and keep their culture alive. So it's different than the cage. But my biggest flaw with this episode would be that plot I just explained. They never outright say with Pike. Instead, they kind of try to force him to fall in love with this girl, and they force him to stay, which of course he's not going to be okay with. If they just told him from the beginning what their plan was, maybe he might not have been so upset and resistant with them. I mean, probably still would be resistant, but maybe not so antagonistic towards them. If they were just honest. But, and that's a trope I hate in shows, but I can buy that these aliens see themselves as so superior to human beings is that they don't think that the humans can be reasoned with and would feel they're too superior and don't need to explain themselves. So I could buy that in this situation, but still, it seems like it could have been avoided. They just explained this deal from the beginning, but then we wouldn't have this great episode. And so we get scenes of them trying to, the crew trying to break them free, and they can't seem to break anything, but the doctor explains that this could be illusion. They can control everything that they see and hear, kind of like the Outer Limits guy. Now, this is what I'm thinking about the rules of these illusions, because they show that when they misbehave Pike, they can punish them, and we see Pike go to this, it looks like a version of hell, where he's drenched in fire and burning alive, and he's and he's in tons of pain, and the aliens threaten, the Telosians threaten that every time he misbehaves, they could punish him by doing that, which puts him in pain. So obviously it's more than just a visual illusion that they're doing. I would equate it to the episode Spectre of the Gun, which is not an episode I like, but the rules that they made up is, even though the Wyatt Earp situation that they created is not real and those people aren't real, they appear real, and so the human being, as long as their senses, they believe it's real, it can affect them. So Chekhov died because he got shot with the gun because he was convinced, because he was convinced it was real. Now it would be virtually impossible. You can't just say to yourself, "Oh, this isn't real," because you have to be completely convinced that it isn't real, which is impossible for a human being to do, which is why Spock's solution was to give, because he's a Vulcan and has complete control of his mental faculties, he's able to block it out and be 100% certain it's not real. But human beings don't have that kind of mental control. So the way they solved the situation by him giving him mind melds to the other crew, and in order to share that mental control with them. So I kind of see this as a similar situation with the cage, that they're feeling pain because they believe it's real, and it would be virtually impossible. They would have to have the mental control of a Vulcan in order to not believe it. They can't simply say, oh, this isn't real. That's not going to hack it. Their senses are still, even if they try to tell themselves, they wouldn't have complete control over their faculties, and their senses would still be telling them this is real. So their pain, they would feel the pain. And so that I would buy. That does make a lot of sense. And it does make sense when the Telosians threaten to destroy the Enterprise, because they're right that they could give people illusions and make them do the wrong thing, make them think they're doing one thing, but really they're like setting the ship to explode. So he totally could do that. It's something I like to quote when he says, "Your ship release me or we'll destroy it." Anyway, but then, Pike learns that they can't read his thoughts if he expresses intense hatred or intense anger, and so he keeps trying to do that, but yet they keep punishing him. And I like how through these fantasies, Vina keeps trying to convince him, knock the shit off. And I like how when they're in that Mojave fantasy and with the horse riding, she was like, when he kept talking, asking her questions about the Telosians and talking about anger, she's like, dude, don't you remember my headaches, dear? I get them when you talk like that. Kind of implying, they're going to fucking punish us. Shut the fuck up. But then when she talks about having offspring with him, he's like, well, those headaches would be hereditary, Which is interesting, but again, this could have been avoided if they just explained that they're not there to control, punish them, that they want them to thrive. If they would just explain that from the beginning. So then it leads to they eventually bring down number one and that yeoman. Now, I gotta mention that line earlier in the episode where Pike says, oh, it's hard for me to get used to a woman being on board, because he's talking about the yeoman because she's hot and he doesn't like being around. Ooh, I can't control myself around hot chicks, which I guess is how men in the 60s thought. But anyway, but he didn't realize he was saying this to a woman, and he's like, well, you're different. I don't really think of you that way because you're not hot. Essentially. And that scene seems so cringy now, but in the 60s, I reckon it was there in order to try to appease these executives, because having, a main female cast member who's a main member of a military structure, it would be very unheard of. In fact, as I said, it's a strong possibility that was one of the main reasons why the show rejected the pilot, was because of it. And so them throwing in that line, as cringy as it is now, was them trying to placate the execs and be like, well, okay, there may be a woman surfing on the bridge, but he's not really that comfortable with it. And I also recall what the showrunner of season 3 of the original series, Gene Roddenberry, once said that the reason they included women in the original series wasn't to make any statement about equality or women's rights, is just to have the eye candy on the show. So I don't really, but maybe it seems with number one that wasn't their intention, at least. But then that's part of the reason why this pilot is rejected. But I do find it really satisfying, I shall say, that Strange New Worlds as a continuation of this. And pretty much every bridge crew member, main senior officer, is a woman. Other than you got Pike, Spock, you have the Enar dude, whatever his name is, but he's in engineering, and you got Mbega, but he's a doctor in a sick bay. So the rest of the bridge crew are women, basically, or at least the senior officers. And I love that. Can't get used to a woman on the bridge. Well, we're gonna make a new show where everyone on the bridge is a woman practically. And of course, he has no problem with this because this show is not written in the 60s. And so that redeems it for me. But anywho, where was I? Okay, so yeah, and again, having them, he sets a trap for the Telosians by leaving the phasers by the little cubby hole because he knows they're gonna come in and get it, and he catches them and strangles him, and they try to shoot the glass so they can get out of the cage, but it doesn't appear to happen. But he's like, and this is good reasoning. He's like, I'm pretty sure this phaser actually does work. If you don't stop this illusion that's showing me that the we didn't blow a hole in that cage, I want to just test my theory on your head. And points the phaser to his head, which again is a badass moment. It really makes me like Pike. But and they do this thing, and when they, the Telosians, when they first bring down number one and the yeoman, they're like, well, if you don't like Vina, maybe take one of these women. And Pike is ignoring him and refuses to engage, but the yeoman actually, obviously has the hots for Pike. But they said that they reveal, and this line, I think, the way, the tone of the voice is different. It sounds like this was added in afterwards, where he says that he reveals that number one actually has fantasies about him. And I remember reading a novel once that addressed this and how uncomfortable it made Pike to know this. And I kind of buy that, because that's something that someone might have, but they would never ever want to express this to someone they work with, especially a superior officer in the military structure, and so would absolutely bury this and keep it hidden. But the Telosians are able to read thoughts, and so would bring these things. You can tell how horrified she is that they explain this to him, that they tell Pike about it. And it does show that how beings with these powers could be quite destructive. But anyway, so they take Pike. Pike takes him to the surface, and they're like, all right, well, whatever. You think you escaped, but we wanted you to come here anyway. And he's like, now you choose your woman, and you can repopulate the surface. And then it's really interesting, because Pike is like, all right, I tell you what. I'll stay here with Vina as long as you let my crew members go. Let my ship go, let my crew members go, and we'll stay behind. And I think they would have taken that deal, because that's what they wanted, basically. But number one steps up and says it's wrong to enslave the human race. It's wrong to create a whole race of slaves, which again is not what they're gonna do. But she's not giving the correct information, so she puts the phaser to overload, and then the Telosians come up, and they, after getting all the library banks or whatever from the Enterprise, they're like, oh, we didn't realize that you hate captivity so much you'd rather die. This makes you unviable, so we're gonna have to let you go. And they're like, this is gonna mean our eventual extinction. Are you happy now? But it is a bit hard to buy that they're just figuring out now that humans are so resistant to captivity. It seems like that's something, if they're really telepathic, they should have figured out a while ago. But whatever. But then we get to reveal, when they try to get Vina to go with them, that she was completely disfigured and destroyed in the crash, and so she doesn't want to go with them. She wants to stay and keep her illusion. And number one also alluded to the fact that based off of the historical record, she is actually a lot older than she appears to be, which is what we see. Now, this does sort of bring in commentary about beauty, that she would rather, stay on this planet with all these aliens than be seen as ugly, which, I don't know, says something about her vanity, I suppose, or maybe society at the time. But yeah, I don't know, because I also feel like they would have the technology to do some surgeries and make her look better. I mean, it seems like if her only reason for staying behind is her looks, it seems like that's something that would be fixed. But again, I'm relying on that future Star Trek knowledge, and I forgot to tell myself that Star Trek does not exist yet. This is just the first thing ever made. So we don't know that they would have that, especially in the 60s, where they wouldn't think that technology would be that commonplace. But of course, I know that now. Anyway, so the Telosians create a delusion for her. They give her sense of delusion, her beauty back, and they create a version of Pike so she can go live happily ever after. But really, in this version, and I say that compared to the Menagerie, the Telosians are still going to go extinct because they don't actually have a human male there to populate the species. They just gave her an illusion. Unless their illusions are that real, they can make her pregnant, which I doubt. So, I mean, again, no future knowledge. They could just donate sperm or whatever from the Enterprise to solve that issue, but that's never addressed in this episode. They're just like, oh, she gets a delusional Pike to go up. Now, I say this version because the version of the Menagerie is more considered canon, and I always think about that when watching Strange New Worlds, because the version of the Menagerie, everything from the cage is exactly the same up to this point. In the Menagerie's version of the cage, they stop with Pike leaving, and they don't show Vina going off with imaginary Pike. In fact, she mentions in Discovery when Vina reappears in Discovery, which I fucking love. I fucking love the connection Vina and Pike had in Discovery. But anyway, when she appears, she kind of explains to him that she's been living with this delusion, illusion of Pike. And he didn't know that because in actual canon, he didn't actually see her go off with this illusion. What happened was, but it does imply that she was living with an illusion of him. But what happens is, after Pike gets paralyzed in this terrible accident, he's in the blinky chair, which again is kind of, they should have technology where he wouldn't have to be in a blinky chair, but I talked about that when I reviewed the Menagerie. And Spock takes him back to Talos to face the death penalty. I already got into that when I talked about the Menagerie. That's so dumb. But when Spock takes him back, the Telosians give Pike the illusion of being healthy again, so he doesn't have to be in the blinky chair. And so he gets to go off looking young and beautiful and be with Vina, which I think is a much more beautiful, powerful ending. Especially, I always think about that when I think of Strange New Worlds, that this is what's awaiting him, and he doesn't realize it because Pike is aware in Strange New Worlds that he's going to be paralyzed and put in the blinky chair, but he doesn't know that he's actually going to live happily ever after with Vina on Talos 4. So it's really interesting to keep that in mind. And that is a much more powerful ending than the cage, because rather than Vina just getting this illusion of Pike, Pike himself actually is saved from a life of hell of being paralyzed, and is able to go off and live a beautiful, happy life with the woman he loves. And that's the only thing about the Menagerie that's superior to the cage, by the way. But yes, that is a better ending. But of course, they couldn't have ended that this way because we have to have more adventures with Pike, which actually never happened. Shame. But that was the intention, of course, because it's a freaking pilot. So, my rating of The Cage out of 10, I'm going to give this a 9. Excellent. I think this is a really strong, really great episode. As I said, I think it was a great character story for Pike. It did an amazing job of portraying this nuanced, complex character. I wanted to see more of him. I would love to have seen a show where this nuanced character was going on weekly adventures. I would really, really be interested in following him. Instead, we got Kirk. But I know the Kirk fans would disagree, but I never really liked Kirk. I'm sorry. And I like William Shatner even less. But I already talked about that. But yeah, and this was a great sort of way to introduce these characters. It was a very complex situation, a very thought-provoking situation of these aliens with the ultimate illusion and powers and what they could accomplish and how they're just trying to save their species. Like it was just, yeah, I think a really good episode. So that is it for my review of The Cage. Now, I shall be back, I believe, let me just check my schedule down here. Let's see. So Wednesday, I'm going to be covering Where No Man Has Gone Before on Patreon and my series of Revisited, because I already did a review for Where No Man Has Gone Before. So on my channel, on the playlist of the active playlist of Star Trek episodes, that episode Where No Man Has Gone Before will appear on Wednesday, and on my Patreon for those Patreon supporters, I will release my Revisited version of Where No Man Has Gone Before, where I watch the episode again and watch my review again and maybe add some more things I didn't mention in the review, or make some commentary about the review, or some things I changed my mind. And then on Saturday, the next episode is the Cobra Knight maneuver, which I already did a review for as well. So it's the same deal with that, where I will put that on my playlist on my channel, and on Patreon will release my revisited thoughts for the Cobra Knight maneuver. And then on Monday, next Monday, I shall be back here with a fresh new review for Mud's Women. Episode I'm not very fond of, but that will be my fresh review next Monday, so be sure to check me out for that, and check out my channel for many more videos, as I am also covering Star Trek Prodigy currently. Now, I did, of course, want to give a shout out for those who do support me on Patreon, as I am very thankful for that. And this is the first time I'm doing this Patreon shout out, so you must forgive me, please. If I mispronounce your name, please just let me know the proper pronunciation if I happen to I'm trying my best, I'm just not very good at pronouncing names. So we got Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Aviles, Brian A., Alessandro Migalicio, I'm trying, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Bird, Allison Fordyce, and of course, big Patreon supporter Brendan Howells. Thank you all for your support. Very much appreciate it. If you would like to support the channel and get early access to videos, and as I mentioned, the aforementioned Revisited series I'll be doing for the episodes of the original series I've already covered, you can support me on Patreon at any level, gain you access. Higher level, the $5 to $10 level will get you early releases, and the $10 level you can request a video for me to do, and I'll do it. So yes, any Patreon support, very much appreciated, and again, thank you so much for my Patreon supporters. So yeah, if you're finding me for the first time, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.